Black woman in first class mistaken for a nanny. What happened next would change everyone's perspective that day. When accomplished neurosurgeon Dr. Amelia Carter boards with her 8-year-old daughter Sophie, a passenger's misguided assumption transforms into an unexpected teaching moment. Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. The early morning sun painted golden streaks across the terminal windows of JFK International Airport as Dr. Amelia Carter guided her 8-year-old daughter Sophie through the bustling crowd. Her hand instinctively tightened around Sophie's smaller one as they navigated past hurried travelers and rolling suitcases. "Mom, look at that plane." Sophie pressed her face against the glass, her breath creating small clouds of fog. "It's huge." Amelia smiled, watching her daughter's eyes light up with wonder. At times like these, she saw glimpses of herself as a young girl, curious, full of dreams, and unaware of the barriers the world might try to place in her way. "That's an Airbus A380, sweetheart," Amelia explained, checking her watch. They were early for their first-class check-in, just as she liked it. Being punctual was a habit ingrained during her years of medical training, one that had served her well through countless surgeries and hospital rounds. As they approached the first-class counter, Amelia's phone buzzed. Another message from the hospital. The patient she'd operated on yesterday was showing positive signs of recovery. A complex procedure to remove a brain tumor, one that many had deemed inoperable. But Amelia had never been one to back down from a challenge. "Dr. Carter." The airline attendant greeted her with a warm smile, recognizing the name. "We're delighted to have you and your daughter flying with us today." Sophie bounced on her toes, proud whenever someone acknowledged her mother's title. "My mom's a brain surgeon," she announced, as she often did, with unabashed pride. In the first-class lounge, Amelia found a quiet corner where she and Sophie could settle. The plush leather seats embraced them as Sophie pulled out her tablet, loaded with educational games Amelia had carefully selected, a perfect blend of entertainment and learning. "Mom!" Sophie looked up from her game, her expression suddenly serious. "Tommy at school said his dad doesn't believe women can be good doctors. Is that why some people look at us funny sometimes?" Amelia's heart tightened, but she maintained her composed smile. These moments, these teaching opportunities, were precious to her. "Some people have old-fashioned ideas, sweetheart. But you know what? Every time we prove them wrong, we're helping change those ideas, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us." She pulled out a small medical journal from her bag, where her latest research paper was featured. Sophie had seen it earlier and insisted on bringing it along, calling it her mom's superhero story. The article detailed a groundbreaking surgical technique Amelia had developed, one that had already saved dozens of lives. As they sat there, Amelia reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The countless nights studying, the skeptical looks from some professors, the whispered doubts from colleagues. Yet here she was, one of the most respected neurosurgeons on the East Coast, raising a daughter who saw no limits to what she could achieve. A voice over the intercom announced the beginning of boarding for their flight to San Francisco, where Amelia was scheduled to deliver a keynote speech at a major medical conference. Sophie gathered her things with practiced efficiency, another trait she'd inherited from her mother. "Ready for an adventure?" Amelia asked, standing and straightening her blazer. Sophie grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. "Always ready, Mom." As they walked toward the gate, Amelia noticed the mix of glances they received, some admiring, others curious, and a few questioning. She held her head high, as she always did. Every step they took was a statement, every achievement a testament to what was possible when talent and determination refused to bow to prejudice. Little did she know that this routine flight would become anything but ordinary, challenging not just prejudices but also putting her skills to the ultimate test. As they approached the gate, the first chapter of an unexpected journey was about to unfold. The boarding process was proceeding smoothly as Amelia and Sophie made their way down the jet bridge. First-class passengers were always boarded first, a perk that Amelia appreciated not for its prestige, but for the practical advantage of getting Sophie settled without the rush of other passengers. Seats 2A and 2B. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Sarah, directed them with a professional smile. Right this way. Sophie skipped ahead, her braids bouncing with each step. Window seat, she whispered excitedly to her mother, though they'd already had this discussion 3 times since reaching the airport. As they approached their seats, Amelia noticed the subtle shifts in expression from some of the passengers already seated. She'd grown accustomed to reading these micro-expressions over the years. The slight widening of eyes, the quick double takes, the furrowed brows of confusion. In the prestigious first-class cabin, a black woman and her daughter still seemed to challenge some people's expectations. "Here we are, sweetheart," Amelia said, helping Sophie with her backpack before storing their carry-on in the overhead compartment. Her movements were precise and graceful, developed through years of surgical practice. A distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit occupied the aisle seat across from them. He glanced up from his Financial Times, his eyes moving between Amelia and Sophie with poorly concealed confusion. Amelia had seen that look countless times before, the mental calculations happening behind those eyes, trying to make sense of their presence in first class. "Pardon me," the man spoke up, his voice carrying the polished tone of someone accustomed to authority. "I believe you might be in the wrong section. The main cabin is." "These are our assigned seats," Amelia interrupted smoothly, her voice calm but firm as she showed him their boarding passes. 2A and 2B. The man, who would later introduce himself as Mr. Thompson, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I see. You must be." He paused, his assumptions clearly visible in his expression. "The child's caretaker?" Sophie, who had been arranging her stuffed animals on the window ledge, turned around. "She's not my caretaker, she's I'm Doctor Amelia Carter," Amelia interjected gently, placing a reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder. "And this is my daughter, Sophie." Her tone was educational rather than confrontational, an approach she'd perfected over years of similar encounters. Mr. Thompson's face flushed slightly. "Oh, I see," he managed, quickly retreating behind his newspaper. As other passengers filed past them to their seats, Amelia noticed varying reactions. A young Asian woman in medical scrubs gave her a knowing smile of solidarity. An elderly couple whispered to each other, stealing glances in their direction. A businessman in seat 1C kept looking back, his expression unreadable. Sophie, meanwhile, had become absorbed in the safety card, studying the diagrams with intense concentration. "Mom, did you know the oxygen masks drop automatically if the air pressure changes?" she asked, blissfully unaware of the social undercurrents swirling around them. "That's right, sweetheart," Amelia replied, helping Sophie buckle her seatbelt. She could feel Mr. Thompson's occasional glances, sense his discomfort, his struggle with his own assumptions. As the flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, Sarah approached their seats. "Dr. Carter," she said warmly, "I just wanted to say I attended your lecture at Columbia last month. Your work on pediatric brainstem tumors is revolutionary." Amelia thanked her graciously, noting how Mr. Thompson's newspaper lowered slightly at this exchange. From the corner of her eye, she could see his expression shift from embarrassment to curiosity. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their flight time to San Francisco and the weather conditions. As the plane began to taxi, Sophie grabbed her mother's hand. Takeoff always made her a bit nervous. "Tell me about your presentation again, Mom," Sophie requested, seeking distraction from the movement of the aircraft. Amelia began explaining her upcoming speech at the medical conference, aware that several passengers, including Mr. Thompson, were now listening intently. She spoke clearly and confidently, her words carrying the weight of expertise and experience. As the plane lifted off the ground, Amelia reflected on how this flight was already shaping up to be yet another battlefield in her ongoing war against prejudice. But like every other challenge she'd faced in her career and life, she would handle it with grace, dignity, and the quiet strength that had become her trademark. Little did she know that the real challenge of this flight was yet to come, and it would require far more than just her social grace. It would demand every ounce of her medical expertise. The flight had reached its cruising altitude, the seatbelt signs dimming with a soft ding. Amelia was reviewing her conference presentation on her tablet, while Sophie dozed peacefully beside her, her head resting against the window. The calm before the storm, as it would turn out. Mr. Thompson had been stealing glances at them for the past 20 minutes, clearly wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice carrying a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. "I feel I must apologize for my earlier assumption." Amelia looked up from her tablet, maintaining her professional composure. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." Richard Thompson of Thompson & Associates Banking. He extended his hand across the aisle, which Amelia shook firmly. "I'm afraid I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment." "It happens more often than you might think," Amelia replied, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Sophie. "Though I admit, it can be tiring to constantly prove one's credentials." A young woman in seat 3A leaned forward. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you the Dr. Carter who developed the new technique for brainstem glioma removal? I'm a second-year resident at Mayo Clinic, and your papers are required reading." Before Amelia could respond, Mr. Thompson interjected, "Brainstem what?" "Brain tumors," Amelia explained patiently. "Particularly challenging ones that were once considered inoperable. We've developed a new approach that's shown promising results." The resident, who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chun, eagerly joined the conversation. "Dr. Carter's work has revolutionized the field. The survival rates for these procedures have doubled since her technique was introduced." Mr. Thompson's expression shifted from mild interest to genuine amazement. "I had no idea. That must be incredibly demanding work." "It is," Amelia acknowledged. "But every successful surgery means another family gets to keep their loved one. That makes it worth every challenging moment." The conversation began attracting attention from nearby passengers. A businessman from 1C turned around, introducing himself as James Wilson, whose sister had undergone neurosurgery the previous year. "The impact you neurosurgeons have on families, it's extraordinary," he said earnestly. Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I must admit, Dr. Carter, my earlier behavior was inexcusable. In my line of work, we often talk about breaking glass ceilings in finance, but I realize I'm still carrying biases I wasn't even aware of." "Awareness is the first step toward change," Amelia responded diplomatically. "Though I hope you understand why assumptions about my role as Sophie's caretaker might be particularly problematic." Several passengers nodded in agreement, and Mr. Thompson's face flushed deeper. "Of course. It's just, in my social circle I rarely see," he trailed off, realizing he was potentially making things worse. "Successful black female neurosurgeons?" Amelia completed his thought, her tone gentle but firm. "We exist, Mr. Thompson. We've always existed. The question is whether society has been ready to see us." Dr. Chen added, "That's why your visibility is so important, Dr. Carter. You're inspiring a whole new generation of doctors who might have thought these achievements were out of reach." The conversation was interrupted by Sophie stirring awake. She blinked sleepily, taking in the group of adults now engaged in discussion around her. "Mom, are you telling them about your superhero job again?" The cabin filled with warm laughter, breaking the tension. "Actually, sweetheart," Amelia smiled. "We were discussing the importance of seeing people for who they really are, not who we assume them to be." Mr. Thompson watched the interaction between mother and daughter with newfound respect. "Your daughter must be very proud of you, Dr. Carter." "I am," Sophie declared, now fully awake. "My mom saves people's brains, and she teaches other doctors to do it too." The pride in Sophie's voice touched everyone within earshot. Even the flight attendants had slowed their service to listen to the conversation. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed from one of initial tension to one of mutual respect and understanding. Little did they know that this newfound respect would soon be put to the ultimate test, as circumstances would soon require Dr. Carter to demonstrate her skills in the most dramatic way possible. The peaceful atmosphere in the cabin shattered with a sudden commotion from the business class section. A flight attendant's voice cut through the air. "Is there a doctor on board? We need a doctor immediately." Before anyone could react, Amelia was already on her feet. "I'm a neurosurgeon," she announced clearly, her voice carrying the authority of countless emergency situations. "Sophie, stay with Dr. Chun," she instructed, receiving a quick nod from the resident. Making her way quickly through the cabin, Amelia found a middle-aged man convulsing in his seat, his wife hysterical beside him. The passengers around them had backed away, creating a small space in the cramped cabin. "I'm Dr. Carter. Please give me room to work," she commanded, her surgical precision evident in every movement. "How long has he been seizing?" About 2 minutes," the flight attendant stammered. "He just suddenly started shaking and—" Amelia was already checking the man's vital signs, her trained eyes noting every detail. "Sir, can you hear me?" she called out as the seizure began to subside. The man's eyes were unfocused, and there was a slight droop to the left side of his face. "He's been having terrible headaches all week," his wife sobbed. "He said it was just stress." "Get me the emergency medical kit," Amelia ordered, noticing the man's pupils were unequal, a telltale sign that made her heart race. "And I need to know how long until we can make an emergency landing." Mr. Thompson, who had followed to offer assistance, was already on his phone. "I have connections at Chicago O'Hare. We're about 30 minutes out." "He may not have 30 minutes," Amelia muttered, her mind racing through options. "This looks like a ruptured aneurysm. The seizure was likely caused by bleeding in his brain." The flight attendant returned with the medical kit. Amelia quickly rifled through it, finding basic supplies but nothing adequate for the severity of the situation. The cabin had gone completely silent, every passenger watching the drama unfold. "His pressure's building up," Amelia announced, noting the man's deteriorating condition. Without intervention, he could suffer permanent brain damage or worse. Sophie had crept closer, watching her mother work with wide eyes. "Mom, like Mr. Rodriguez last month?" she asked, referring to a similar case Amelia had handled. That sparked an idea. "Yes, exactly like that," Amelia said, her mind racing. "I need a small drill bit, something sterile, about 3 millimeters in diameter." "Doctor, you're not suggesting—" Dr. Chun began, understanding dawning on her face. "A burhole, yes. It's his only chance." Amelia turned to the flight attendants. "I need the pilot's permission to perform an emergency procedure. This man needs a small hole drilled in his skull to relieve the pressure. Without it, he won't make it to Chicago." The next few minutes were a flurry of activity. The pilot authorized the procedure, while Mr. Thompson used his connections to ensure emergency services would be waiting in Chicago. The flight attendants found a maintenance kit with a small, sterile drill bit, and Dr. Chun helped prepare the makeshift operating area. "Mrs. Thompson," Amelia addressed the wife calmly, "I need your consent. This procedure carries risks, but without it, your husband's condition will deteriorate rapidly." The woman nodded through her tears, clutching her husband's hand. "Please save him." Amelia worked with practiced precision, her hands steady as she created a small burr hole to relieve the building pressure in the man's skull. The cabin was dead silent except for the hum of the engines and Amelia's calm, clear instructions to Dr. Chun, who assisted. "Pressure's decreasing," Amelia announced after what felt like hours but was only minutes. "His pupils are equalizing." The man's color improved, and his breathing became more regular. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. "That was—" Mr. Thompson shook his head in amazement. "Incredible." "That was my mom," Sophie stated proudly from where she stood with the flight attendant, earning tearful smiles from several passengers. As they began their descent into Chicago, the man had stabilized. Emergency medical teams were waiting at the gate to transport him to the nearest hospital. Before they took him away, his wife grabbed Amelia's hands. "How can we ever thank you?" she whispered. "Just make sure he gets proper follow-up care," Amelia replied professionally, though her eyes were warm with compassion. "And maybe remember that excellence comes in all colors." After the emergency landing in Chicago and the patient's transfer to the local hospital, the flight resumed its journey to San Francisco. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. The same passengers who had earlier harbored doubts about Amelia's presence in first class now looked at her with undisguised admiration and respect. The way you handled that situation, Dr. Carter, Dr. Chen said, shaking her head in amazement. In my residency, we've only read about emergency burr holes in textbooks. To see one performed at 35,000 feet. Amelia smiled modestly while tucking Sophie back into her seat. Sometimes the most unconventional situations require unconventional solutions. The key is staying calm and trusting your training. Mom's always calm, Sophie chimed in, beaming with pride. Even when I spilled juice all over her presentation papers last week. The cabin erupted in gentle laughter, breaking the lingering tension from the emergency. Mr. Thompson, who had been quietly contemplative since their return to the air, turned to face Amelia. Dr. Carter, I owe you more than just an apology, he began, his voice heavy with sincerity. Today has been educational, to say the least. When I first saw you boarding, I made assumptions that now seem not just wrong, but embarrassingly shallow. The banking world must be quite different from medicine, Amelia observed diplomatically. That's just it, Mr. Thompson replied, leaning forward. In my position, I've often prided myself on being progressive. We have diversity initiatives, inclusion programs, but today showed me how much unconscious bias I still carry. Watching you save that man's life. He paused, collecting his thoughts. It made me realize how many brilliant professionals like yourself might have been overlooked in my own industry because of preconceptions like mine. Dr. Chen nodded enthusiastically. That's why representation matters so much. Dr. Carter, you're not just saving lives in the operating room. You're changing perceptions every day. A young black girl, perhaps 12 or 13, approached their seats from the business class section. She had witnessed the entire emergency unfold. Dr. Carter? She said shyly. I want to be a doctor too. My guidance counselor said it might be too difficult, but after seeing you today... Amelia's expression softened. What's your name, sweetheart? Jasmine. Well, Jasmine, let me tell you something. Every great doctor started with a dream just like yours. The path isn't easy, but nothing worth doing ever is. She reached in her bag and pulled out a business card. Have your parents email me. I'd be happy to tell you about some excellent medical school preparation programs. Jasmine's face lit up as she clutched the card, and her mother, watching from a few rows back, mouthed a silent thank you to Amelia. Mr. Thompson watched this interaction with growing interest. Dr. Carter, would you consider speaking at our next corporate leadership summit? I think your story, and more importantly, your perspective, could be invaluable to our executives. Changing minds in medicine and finance? Mom's going to need a superhero cape, Sophie giggled. The flight attendant Sarah approached with an update. Dr. Carter, the hospital in Chicago called. Your patient is stable and responding well to treatment. They said your quick action saved not just his life, but prevented what could have been severe brain damage. A quiet murmur of appreciation spread through the cabin. James Wilson from 1C turned around again. You know, Dr. Carter, my sister's neurosurgeon was good, but watching you work today, would you be willing to look at her follow-up care? As Amelia discussed potential consultation arrangements with Mr. Wilson, she noticed how the other passengers were listening intently, their faces showing genuine interest rather than the guarded skepticism from earlier. Even the flight attendants seemed to move through the cabin with a renewed sense of respect and admiration. Mom, Sophie whispered, tugging at her sleeve, I think you made a lot of friends today. We did more than that, sweetheart, Amelia replied softly. We helped change some minds, and sometimes that's just as important as saving lives. The remainder of the flight became an impromptu networking session, with passengers from both first class and business class finding excuses to pass by and engage in conversation. Dr. Chen eagerly discussed residency programs, while Mr. Thompson made notes about diversity initiatives he planned to implement at his firm. As the sun began to set outside their window, casting a warm glow across the cabin, Amelia reflected on how a day that began with confronting prejudice had transformed into an opportunity for education, understanding, and genuine connection. As the plane began its final descent into San Francisco, the golden rays of the setting sun painted the cabin in warm hues. Amelia watched as Sophie pressed her face against the window, marveling at the city lights emerging beneath them. The day's events had transformed what could have been a routine flight into something far more meaningful. "Mom," Sophie said thoughtfully, turning away from the window, "remember when you told me that sometimes we have to be first so others can follow?" Amelia smiled, touched by her daughter's recall of their many conversations about breaking barriers. "I do, sweetheart. Why do you bring that up?" "Well, I saw how Jasmine looked at you today. It was the same way I look at you when you tell me about your surgeries." Sophie paused, showing wisdom beyond her years. "You were her first today, weren't you?" The question drew the attention of nearby passengers, including Mr. Thompson, who had spent the last hour reorganizing his upcoming week to accommodate a diversity and inclusion workshop at his firm. "You know, Sophie," he interjected gently, "your mother was a first for many of us today. She taught us lessons we didn't even know we needed to learn." Dr. Chun, who had moved to a closer seat during the flight to continue their professional discussion, nodded in agreement. "In medical school, we learn about breaking down barriers, but seeing it in action—" She glanced at Amelia with admiration. "That's something else entirely." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their imminent landing. As passengers began securing their belongings, a flight attendant approached with a stack of business cards and notes. "Dr. Carter, several passengers asked me to pass these to you. There's also a message from the hospital in Chicago. They'd like to consult with you about the patient's long-term care plan." Amelia accepted the items graciously, noting how different this was from her usual flights, where she often felt the weight of others' preconceptions. Today, those same preconceptions had been systematically dismantled, not through confrontation, but through competence, grace, and action. "Dr. Carter, Mr. Thompson said as they began their final descent, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about seeing people for who they really are. I'm hosting a conference next month on leadership and finance. Would you consider being our keynote speaker? Not about medicine, but about breaking barriers and challenging assumptions." Before Amelia could respond, Sophie chimed in, "Mom's really good at that. She says the best way to break barriers is to be so good they can't ignore you." The cabin filled with warm laughter, but there was understanding in it now, not the awkward tension from the start of their journey. As the plane touched down, Amelia reflected on how this flight had embodied everything she tried to teach Sophie about handling prejudice. Not with anger, but with excellence. Not with resentment, but with resilience. The passengers began gathering their belongings, but instead of the usual rush to exit, there was a sense of reluctance to end the shared experience. Dr. Chen exchanged contact information with Amelia, eager to discuss mentorship opportunities. Several other passengers waited to share final words of gratitude and appreciation. "You know what the best part of today was, Mom?" Sophie asked as they finally stood to leave, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet cabin. "Everyone got to see what I see every day, that you're not just a great doctor, you're a great person." Mr. Thompson, overhearing this, nodded in agreement. "Your daughter is right, Dr. Carter. Today wasn't just about medical expertise. It was about humanity, about seeing beyond our initial judgments to recognize the excellence that exists in all its forms." As they made their way off the plane, Amelia felt Sophie's small hand slip into hers. The gesture reminded her of why she persevered through every barrier, every prejudice, every challenge, not just for herself, but for Sophie and for every child who needed to see that excellence knows no boundaries. The San Francisco evening greeted them with a cool breeze as they emerged from the jet bridge. Behind them, connections had been forged, perspectives had been changed, and a small but significant victory had been won in the ongoing battle against prejudice. "Ready for your conference tomorrow, Mom?" Sophie asked as they walked toward baggage claim. "More than ready," Amelia replied, squeezing her daughter's hand. "And you know what? I think I just found the perfect opening for my keynote speech. Because sometimes, the most powerful lessons about breaking barriers don't happen in operating rooms or conference halls, but at 35,000 feet, where prejudice gives way to respect and assumptions yield to understanding."
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.